All right. Hello again. In this video, I'm going to be talking about SSH config. If you don't already know, my name is Winston Lamte. I'm a software engineer. And let's dive right into SSH config. So, what exactly is this whole shebang? So, you have your servers that you typically connect to via SSH. On those servers, you have a file that sort of defines the rules that manages, how users can connect to your server via SSH. So, what ports can they connect to? Should we allow passwords and things like that? So, the SSH config is that file within your remote server that defines how it manages connections. It defines how your server manages SSH connections, right? So typically there are certain rules that you'd want to have in place for a more secure server setup, and so let's go look at a few of these, primarily just three. So first one is disabling remote root access. So this rule states, can a user connect to this remote server as a root user? And typically we want to not allow that. They have to log in as a non-root user, and then for such security reasons we disable that. So the rule for that is permit root login, which we can set to no, and that will sort of enforce disabling this. Another rule that's available is password authentication. So typically when you're connecting to your SSH servers, typically you'd use some public private key pair to connect to the SSH. However, if you don't have that, you can use password authentication, but we typically want to disable this because then attackers can sort of brute force their way into the SSH, into our server by just randomly spamming a bunch of passwords until they get the right one. So we also typically want to disable this, and the rule for that is password authentication, which we can set to no. And lastly, optionally, we can change the default SSH port from 22. So by default, widely known, the SSH port for your servers are on your SSH server is going to be on 22. So if we don't want the hassle of having to deal with attackers constantly hitting 22 with different trying to exploit vulnerabilities, we can optionally update from 22 to something else. So let's look into a short demonstration of the things that we've spoken about. This is my terminal. I have two tabs. On this left side is my host machine, and then on this right side is my remote server. I'm using multipass to demonstrate this, so it's sort of like a VM on my machine, but it cuts, it conveys what it is that I want to, it conveys a representation of a remote server. So here, if I do let's say sudo ss, don't worry about this, but tlnp grep sh, we'll see that we're currently listening on port 22 on our SSH config, and then let's look at our SSHD configs. So what rules we have in place on our remote server to handle SSH connection. So the SSH config file can be found in, let's go to etc SSH. If I list out what's in there, you'll see here we have this SSHD config file. Now let's see the contents of this. So let's nano SSHD config, and we'll see here it has a bunch of things that have been commented out. We have the port, which by default is again 22. We have the things like the permit root login, which at this point is prohibited password, and then we also have at the bottom here password authentication. which should be around here. Yes, password authentication as well. So we're going to update these, and before we do that, let's back up our current config. So if we do mess up, we always have like a backup to refer to. So let's sudo cp sshd config to sshd config. Let's just call it .0, and then we can constantly update to like it .1, .2 as we continue. So now that we have our backup, let's do an ls-l. We can see we have sshd config and sshd config.0. Now let's make that update in there. So let's say sudo nano sshd config, and let's change the port from port 22 to, let's say, port 220. Let's also disable root login. So instead of prohibit password, let's change that to no. And then finally, for password authentication, let's also change that to no. All right. Now let's review. We've changed. Let's sort of like take a quick review. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to exit, and I'm going to do a diff of the sshd config to sshd config.0. And here we can see that we've updated the port, we've updated the root login, and we've also updated the password authentication. So with these changes, let's apply the, let's again look something, SSO-TLP, grep SSH. We'll see that we're still listening on port 22. So even though we have updated the rules, the server hasn't applied those rules yet. And the way we do that is through a few commands. I'm going to show that. It's sudo systemctl daemon reload. So that would reload our daemon. Then we also do a sudo systemctl ssh.socket restart, I believe. No. Okay, so it's actually sudo systemctl restart ssh.socket, and then finally we'll do a systemctl restart our ssh and myself. Great. So with these three commands, the rules that we defined, the new rules we defined in our config file should be taking root. So let's do a sudo sstlmp grep ssh. And we'll see that we're now listening, instead of on port 22, we're listening on port 2220. So we've applied those changes on our remote machine. Let's try to connect to our remote machine and see what happens. So here I'm going to SSH into Ubuntu at 192.168.65.3. So this is the address of my remote server, in this case my multipass instance. And then I do have an identity file, so .multipass v1. And we'll see that connection refused on port 22. So we know that SSH by default connects to our remote instances via port 22, but since we've updated that, it's going to say connection refused. So now, if we need to SSH, we'll have to specify a different port. So let's specify what it was that we initially put in, 220, and voila. You can see that we've successfully connected to our remote instance. And so here, that's really it. So 100%. And then you verify